Good morning. My name is Elaine Wilson, and I'm here today to speak to you about a post-impressionist artist whose name is Paul Gauguin. He's gotten a kind of a bad press over the years for his time with Gauguin when he cut off his ear, and for the fact that he was a stockbroker and he abandoned his wife and 5 children and went off to the islands to paint. But there's a lot more to him than that. And even though nothing that I've said is false, it's all very true. I think you're going to find with a deeper understanding of who he actually was and what his feelings really were, I think you're going to appreciate him. At least you'll appreciate him enough to understand him. You may not like him, but you can appreciate that. So let's take a look at some of the information that I want to share with you about him. First of all, there is a photograph of him. It's a very good likeness. And the other thing is, I want to talk a little bit about his family. He had one older sister. She was 2.5 years older, about 2 years older than he was. And he was a stockbroker in Paris at the age of 23. He did extremely well in stock brokerage. He lived well. Then there was a crash. And then, you know, when that happens, there's going to be trouble. He will eventually die, not in Paris, but in the Polynesian Islands. And he will always have a proclivity towards wanting to be in South America, or more specifically, the Pacific Islands. His mother had come from Peru. She was a lovely woman. This is a painting that he did of her. And because his father was a journalist in Paris, there were some issues there, and he really felt he might do better and take care of the family more safely if they lived in Lima, Peru instead of Paris. So the 4 of them, Marie and Paul and the parents, booked passage on a ship to go to Lima. On the ship, his father had a very serious heart attack and died en route to Lima. So this young woman shows up to meet her family at the dock with the 2 children who now no longer have a father. Speaking of a father, he will eventually marry and he will have 5 children. The woman he marries is Danish. Her name is Maddie. And Maddie and the children will end up moving back to Denmark. And they will live out the rest of their lives there. However, he, as a stockbroker, had started to do a little dabbling in paint, and so around the age of 30, he started to paint. He eventually becomes a painter, a sculptor, and a printmaker. There's one of his prints. There's a painting that he did of himself. Now, he kind of looks rather pretentious there. He develops his own style, and part of his pretentiousness comes from the fact that he was rather arrogant. He could be extremely domineering, and he could also be very self-serving. But he was also a dreamer. He was also very hopeful that he was going to be successful, and he really, with the exception of one time, he never really gave up. I just pointed the arrow at his halo that he gave himself, and he has conquered the snake from the Garden of Eden, and behind the arrow you can see apples back here, the forbidden fruit. He did not have trouble with being a little pretentious. Here's his family. There's Maddie, and there are all of the children going this way through the list down here. They will have to move after this crash. They will have to move out of their wonderful home in a good section of Paris to an area that is really a poor class, and they will have a third floor apartment right here. This will be the first time that he actually has a studio. There are 3 rooms in the apartment for all of them and him, and he has a studio. In this picture, you can see either a maid that's with the children or perhaps Maddie and 3 of the children here. And she seems to be doing a little sewing. Things get pretty rough, and Maddie can't handle it anymore, and the children need food. It's just not working. So she said, you know, my family wants us to do well, and I think we should move back to Denmark, to Copenhagen. And he goes. Later, she goes in the summer of 1884 with the 5 children, but it won't be until November that he goes over there. And when he goes, the family said, not a problem, we're going to help you. We'll find you work. Well, guess what? They found him work selling canvas tarps that you use for tents. Trouble was, he didn't speak any Danish. So he really couldn't communicate with the people who wanted to buy tarps if they did, and most of them didn't. So that really didn't go well. So it added to his depression, and it certainly didn't do anything to help solidify the marriage. In fact, he eventually leaves, and he takes one of the children with him. This is Clovis. Takes Clovis with him, not as revenge, but simply because he wants to help out if he can. So he takes the middle child with him, and they go back to Paris in June of 1985. He will not go back to Denmark again to live. The family really doesn't want her to have much more to do with him, and she finds a job working as a translator and is bringing in enough money to help keep the family together. And in the meantime, as long as they are apart, which will be 23 years, they are never divorced. He never stopped loving her. He never stopped caring about the children. But he did care a great deal about his painting. When he and Clovis are in Paris, Clovis becomes very ill because food is hard for them to pay for. He didn't have any money, and the child is sick. And so Marie, his older sister, takes Clovis under her wing, gets him enrolled in a boarding school so he has regular hours and food and is in a much better environment for a little boy that age. And in the meantime, Paul goes off to Port-Aven, Brittany. This will be where he goes to find a new place, a primitive place, a different place to be and to work. Now, this is the front of the hotel that he stayed in, and he will go to Brittany 4 different times. It's called a low-budget hotel, and when I learned about that, I thought, well, now what does low budget mean? Well, low budget means that for 60 francs a month, which in today's the euro to the dollar, that's about $67 a month, he would have bed, breakfast, and dinner with cider. That's not a bad deal for 60 francs a month, so he could afford that. He said, I went there to find a certain wildness and a primitiveness, and he does find it there. That won't be the last stop for him, but it is a place where he starts first to come into his own. This is one of the paintings that he did. One of the things that's fascinating about the work of Gauguin is all of the color that he includes and the imagination that he introduces. I want you to watch as I show these slides today the color cadmium yellow. It's a favorite of his, and he will use it a lot. And he will also spot that off with little bits of red here and there, and other colors too, but he loves to use the cadmium yellow. It's almost a signature color for him. Another thing to notice as you look at these slides is, for some reason or other, now all of the people in Brittany wore clogs. They wore wooden shoes. But these shoes are extremely large. This is a large foot for this small child. And the same is true over here. And he seems to always make the feet on the people much larger than probably would be correct. Another thing to notice about his work as we go through it, and I'll point it out sometimes, but not every time, there are things scattered in his pictures that give you a chance to really wander around. This is the goat shepherdess. And here are the goats. Here's the man over the hill, and he's working. There's a cow behind her. There are all kinds of interesting things going on in the pictures that he paints. And are they real? They are real sketches that he has done, but they are imaginary in that they are his personal creations, which is one of the problems that he will have with Monet. He and Monet start to paint together, not physically always together, but they knew of each other. Those two are Monet's. These are Gauguin's. And if you notice, when Gauguin started to paint, Gauguin did not have formal art lessons. He just started to paint. So here you see a painting by each one of the men, and up here again. And Monet could relate to all of this. But the two paintings that you saw just previously are very different. And that will give Monet a great deal of stress. And he comes to actually despise Gauguin. He really doesn't like him. He feels that he has betrayed the Impressionist movement because he changed his style. Well, he was a post-Impressionist. We didn't know that at the time. But he also was a man who wanted to create just as much as Monet did. But this is Monet's style. This will not continue to be Gauguin's style. Other artists also played important roles in his life. One of them was Edgar Degas. I talked about him last week. And Edgar Degas can come off very rough and crude and rude, and yet at the same time, he was very, very supportive of Gauguin. At one point, he bought 30 of his paintings because Gauguin needed money, and Degas was wealthy. So Degas bought paintings to help pay for Gauguin's trip back to the Pacific Islands, which is where he wanted to go to paint. Another artist that plays an important role in his life, of course, is Vincent van Gogh. Coming up in about 3 weeks, I will be discussing Vincent van Gogh with you, so I won't get into a lot of details about him at this point, but he does invite Gauguin to Arles. And they do stay in this little yellow house on the corner. I was there recently. The house is gone because it was bombed during the war, and so we don't have the house. But we still have the town of Arles, and we still have a lot of Van Gogh's haunts, which I'll share with you in a couple of weeks. Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse loved Gauguin's colors. Look at the colors in this. They're fabulous. They really felt that they had struck pay dirt when they came across examples of his work in exhibits in Paris. So they become two very big fans of his. One of the words that's important is in this quote that Gauguin said, "It's our imagination that makes the picture when we confront nature." Imagination is key to understanding Gauguin. Imagination is what his work is all about. Keep that in mind as you go through this with me this hour. When he is in Port-Aven, he finds that it's a town that has a lot of houses and a lot of water wheels. There are actually 15. Today, if you would go there, and they'd love to have you as a guest, you could find the hotel. You would find one working water wheel. I can't tell you that it's that one, but it's similar to that. And also notice something else about the painting. When Gauguin does this, he is painting in somewhat of an impressionist style, but he has freed himself to not paint exactly the same way. He has smooth areas, he has textured areas, he has his own way of making his statements, his own way of imagining a fence, purple, blue, red, brown. He doesn't make a lot of rules because that way he doesn't have to break them. This is one of the sketches that he did. He would sketch on site, but he preferred not to paint on site. He would go to his studio, or when he was at Port Avon, he would go to his room, and that's where he would paint. Here's one of the pictures from Brittany. And as you look at this, you can see the style of clothing of the men and of the women, and the wooden shoes that they wore, and these little hats or headdresses that they had. This piece is fascinating in that he changes the color. I noticed this as I was coming here today to lecture, and I looked across the countryside in Lancaster County. The colors change, and he picks up on this, but he does it with such great imagination. So this hill comes in and slips behind the hill where these two are. There's somebody in the field. You may have already noticed him now that I have clued you into seeing those extra things that he tucks in his work. This painting is called The Swineherd. It's one of his most famous paintings from Brittany, and as you can see, the colors in it are brilliant. Look what he does back here with the fields and the trees. Trees do not have to be green, he said. If I see pink or purple or other colors in them, I can make them whatever colors I choose. Here's the swine that the man is herding. There he is in his normal costume. Now I'm going to take you on a walk, so watch the arrow and follow along. This arrow will take you through the painting and around the hill. It's almost breathtaking. Just keep going around and around, back through the little town, and then back up the hill. Subtle things that he included in his work. It's no wonder that it's one of his more famous paintings from his time when he was living there. Look at the color that's in it. Look at how he used color to support his imagination. He also used, not all the time, but he used a technique called cloisonné, which is using dark outlines around colors to make sure that the forms are evident. There's somebody in the background. You notice immediately the two women right here, but you've got somebody back here too. And you have somebody back here. So his work is not just about what's in the front or the foreground with these pictures. It's what is all there, everything. His work requires some work from you to move visually around through it. There's the cloisonné that I mentioned before. See how it's outlining her headdress, and it does the same over here. Sure, he could have just put the white line in, because nature doesn't have black lines around the outsides of things. Sometimes he did that, and sometimes he didn't. He was very, very, very intrigued with their traditional dress and the aprons and the different colored of costumes, the skirts and the tops that they wore. He also was very impressed with their strong Catholic faith because he had been raised Catholic. And that was very important to him, and you'll see that as we go through here. His landscapes that he does often, and I don't have them here today, are dotted though with granite crosses and with little churches. Little churches be sprinkled through the environment. Now, I want you to notice something else. See how this tree cuts through here? It actually cuts this painting exactly in half, but it's not bothersome. It simply gives you a sense of direction as you look at this, because otherwise You might miss the houses that are back here. You'll see this and the landscape and the two figures in prayer under the tree. But you might have missed that if he hadn't done that. Here's one of the sketches that he would have done. I showed you the one earlier of the woman gathering wood. This one is interesting. I'm going to point out a few things about it, and then I'm going to show you the painting he actually went back to his room and did from it. Here are two figures that are in a wrestling match. This man has a hold of the back of that man's head. Down here, there are a lot of women praying. Here is a cow. Okay, try to make some sense out of this one, folks. And here, of course, is this tree that is cutting everything in half. Well, look what he does with that. This is called Vision of the Sermon. This is a painting that he did, having gone to church and heard the sermon about Jacob who wrestled with the angel all night long. And if you want to look it up, there it is, Genesis 32, 22 to 31. Jacob wrestles with the angel, which he says is God. And in the morning, he is still holding on. Jacob will not let go. And the bottom line is that God eventually touches the hip socket, one of his hip sockets, and Jacob will then limp for the rest of his life, but he will assume the name of Israel because he will be the father of many. Well, these women have been there, and they have heard the story about how that happened. This is the angel, and there's Jacob fighting with him. And then you need to understand why the tree is here. This is reality, and this is the women's imagination. They couldn't have seen that. They didn't live then. But they can imagine what it would have been like. And so therefore they are in a prayerful position, and the tree divides reality from the imagined. I've always been fascinated with this figure. When this painting is discussed by art historians, nobody talks about this guy. And I say guy because this is a man. And this is a man that looks very much like a profile of Gauguin. And I just can't get over the fact that, for me anyway, he hasn't included himself as part of the group that had heard that sermon. What's a cow doing in here? Well, after church, these women and men would have literally gone out, and their Sunday afternoon was often spent, they would cross themselves, and then men would decide to wrestle each other. Well, the one that finally beat all the others who had challenged him would have to have a prize. And guess what? In this painting, there's the prize. That's the cow. The cow will be the winner of not this match, but the wrestling match that would have occurred in the churchyard after the sermon was over. Here's another sketch that he did. He loved Brittany. He loved being away from Paris, and he loved being away from all of the stress and the rushing around that occurred when you're in a big city. So here he's done a sketch of this girl. There are ones that he did of them as well. But notice the background. We have ducks back here, and we have somebody tilling a field back here. Always look into his work. There's more to it than what's right in the front. The church that he had attended was one that had a crucifix of Christ, and he quickly did this sketch, and he did another sketch of the face just to get it a little bit more exact. This one doesn't have an eye, and this one does down here. Then he does this painting. This is again one of his more popular pieces. It's called The Yellow Christ. Christ wasn't yellow in the crucifix that he saw in the church. He's used his imagination, and he's used his wonderful cadmium yellow color. Look at it, it's all through that particular painting. When he did this piece, he based it upon what was in that church, and then after it was finished, he took it to the priest at the church and asked him if he'd like to have it for in the church. Well, I think it's good that the priest said no, because we, as a nation of people, a world of people, have better access to the Yellow Christ painting than we would if it was tucked away in a small church in Brittany. We might not know too much about it. The priest turned down his offer, and so it is going to be something that Gauguin will paint later himself. Before I move from this piece, I want to point this out. See this man going over the stile that's here, and two other people waiting for him? He's running away from this scene, from the horror of it. He's running away, and these women are in sorrow, and they are praying in front of it. Here's Gauguin's portrait. This is the same painting. He'd taken it, he had it in his home, or his room, and you'll notice that it's a reverse. It's a reverse because he paints himself through a mirror. He can't paint himself, he doesn't know what he looks like. So he paints himself, and the painting is behind him, but everything is reversed. And in this case, he shows himself as the figure of Christ who has been crucified. There were times in his life when he really felt that that was the case, that the world was crucifying him. He will eventually get to the islands that he has so long sought to see, and the first one will be Martinique. He's in Martinique for a while, and he comes back to Paris with a whole armload of paintings, and he has a dealer, and he wants to exhibit his work. In the process of this, Vincent van Gogh was in Paris, and his brother Theo and his wife lived in Paris. They saw this painting of the mango trees and bought it immediately. They just loved it. Something else is important to know about this. Gauguin will talk to them at the exhibition and discuss with them how it was really a decisive experience for him to go to Martinique, and it was there that he really felt like himself. And that will be something that will spur Vincent van Gogh to move to the sunny southern France and the city of Arles to paint, because he also wants to feel more like his real self. Theo, whose one of his jobs was to work as an art dealer, will decide to represent Gauguin, and he will continue to represent Gauguin, Theo will, until he dies. But at the time, Theo had just met him, and they decided on this partnership, and Vincent van Gogh is excited about now going south to study and to learn. This is a picture of this area of Arles. It's an old Roman necropolis, and it's still there. I have walked that particular road back through it. Gauguin will take Vincent van Gogh up on his offer to visit and stay there with him, but he's only there for 9 weeks. You'll learn something about that today. You'll learn a lot more about it when I talk to you specifically about Van Gogh. But here are two of the paintings that they do there. Gauguin arrives one day, and the next day they are out there at that necropolis, and they are painting. Now their styles right here aren't too much different, and you'll notice that Van Gogh has initially, he kind of acted like he was a student to Gauguin. neither one of them was the student. Each one of them was their own person. But Van Gogh starts using all of the cadmium yellows that you see here. He's using those same colors. Notice the difference in their perspective. That's the church, and that is the church. It's much closer viewed by Gauguin and some distance for Van Gogh down that long walkway. There were many sarcophagi there, I guess you say, and both of them include them, and they are not in very good shape here, and I'll tell you, they haven't gotten in any better shape since those two men painted them. They were used for building materials, and people got inside and took valuables that might be on some of the corpses, and it's now a National Heritage Site, and nobody gets in without a ticket, and nobody leaves with parts of the site in their pockets. There's a lot of controversy between these two men during the 9 weeks that they are together, and I choose to call it painting warfare. Here's a scene that they do after going outside, because Van Gogh had been there long enough to know where to go to get some interesting subject matter. Here's part of the problem with the warfare. Van Gogh wanted to rush out. He grabbed all of his painting equipment and his easel and his canvases, and he wanted to rush out and he would paint. And sometimes Van Gogh would paint 3 paintings in one day. Gauguin, he wants to go out and walk around. He wants to see what's there. He wants to drink in the tranquility of the area. He doesn't want to sit there and paint. And he doesn't sit there and paint. So where Van Gogh surrendered to nature, Gauguin absorbed what he could, and then with his imagination. You remember last week I said, Degas said, if you're painting a portrait of somebody, have them sit on the first floor and you go upstairs and paint, because it's what you remember that you should paint. Well, Degas and Gauguin were good friends, and Degas didn't tell him to do this, but he just naturally did. He used his imagination, but he would paint back at the little yellow house where they were living. They had to eat someplace, and they usually went out to eat in the evenings, and the proprietor of one of the restaurants was this woman, and there is a sketch of her. This little thing that's here on the table, he's now attached. It looks kind of unusual, but it is actually just this pin that he's attached to her scarf over there. Before he leaves Arles, he will have gifted Van Gogh with this sketch, and it will be in the Van Gogh family estate. Van Gogh hangs on to that. It's a good likeness, but Gauguin does that on site. What else is going on at the same time? Van Gogh is painting the same scene. Now, we don't have the woman in it, but we do have a scene that shows a club and people sitting around, or restaurant, drinking and eating. And the interesting thing about this piece is that Gauguin will go 3 nights without any sleep over to the restaurant so he can paint it with the incandescent lights on and paint this particular scene. They decide early on that they will honor each other by doing portraits of each other. So this is the one that Gauguin does of Van Gogh. It's not real flattering. This is the one that Van Gogh does of Gauguin. And when Van Gogh saw what Gauguin had interpreted as being his face, and he's working on sunflowers. He has his palette here, and he's got sunflowers, and he's working on the painting. Van Gogh went back to his painting of Gauguin, and he painted his nose blue. He decided he would try to make him as ugly as he could, because that's what he thought that Gauguin had done to him. Again, just another one of the riotous controversies that the two of them got into during their time together. This is a favorite site it's right outside the city of Arles, where Van Gogh would go to paint. So naturally, he took Gauguin there. This is Paul Gauguin's painting that he would have done back in the room, but he would have done lots of sketches ahead of time. Notice the figures of the women right here. This one trundling off with her clothing. And over here you can tell exactly where Van Gogh would have sat as he looked down through here. And it looks so much like this. I've been there. It looks so much like this. But this one is much more imaginatory. So they are both extremely talented men, but both extremely different in how they approach their art and how they approach their lives. Van Gogh decides to do 2 chairs to show their personalities, and this is him. He's got a reed seat, his little pipe, and his pouch of tobacco are there. And over here we have a nice chair. This is Gauguin. And Gauguin, there's a book here, and there's a light there, and there's wonderful carpeting on the floor. Over here it's just the tile floor. Vincent saw himself as different from Gauguin, and Gauguin knew that he was different than Van Gogh. Towards the end of the stay that Gauguin spends with Van Gogh, things really get wild and crazy, and Van Gogh starts yelling a lot, and he knows that Gauguin likes order and peace and quiet, and he does everything to disrupt that because he really wants to get him out of his house. He wants to get rid of him because it's not working, and it's just not a good environment. And one thing leads to another, and then this leads up to him cutting off his ear. And that whole story, as I said, I promise you, I will tell at a later time. But in the meantime, Gauguin leaves Arles and goes back to Paris. And this is one of his pieces of sculpture, Pot's a Pot, a mug that he did. And the arrow is pointing to the fact that the man has no ear. Because, of course, the night before the day that Gauguin left, Vincent cut off part of his ear. And you also know that Gauguin has included the blood trickling down along the neck of the figure. He had just returned from Arles, and he did that piece to try to kind of put everything in perspective for himself. At the same time, he's trying to get out into the community in Paris and kind of get back to what he would consider to be normal life. And what happens is he stumbles across a public beheading. This murderer had killed a prostitute, and he was condemned to be beheaded in public. And Gauguin, unfortunately, happened to be there for that scene. And the reason I say unfortunately, not only did he see the man's head cut off, but before the man's head was cut off, the guillotine knife slipped. It cut off part of the man's face, but he was still alive. And so there's all this thrashing around and finally getting him subdued enough, and they finally do chop off his head. But all of these experiences are life-rocking, and I can't imagine that for any of us it would be different. I think it would be a very difficult experience and a series of experiences in a short period of time. Here's some of his sculpture that he does. And if you look at this piece, he's included a shepherdess with there's some goats over there. So you have a goat herder here on the front of this. He does around 100 different sculptures during his lifetime. They've been able to really salvage or find about 60 so far. They're quite dear in price. He's back on the island. He's doing this piece that he calls the Madonna. And it's Hail Mary, and this would be Mary and the Christ child. And as he is working on the islands, he is a copious writer. And so I have a book that has a whole lot of his writing. If he and Van Gogh had anything in common, it was writing to each other, because they both did that a lot. Not to each other, but writing to their friends. They continued after the ear incident. They continued to write to each other as well. But he is showing one of his friends that he's writing to what he's going to do with this particular painting. It's one of the earlier pieces that he does when he visits Tahiti for the first time. And you'll notice that he wants to make sure that you realize that this is Mary, the halo is there, and that these two people are in prayer, paying their respects to this very noble woman. But you'll also notice that in the painting, he's trying to show that Tahiti is as he dreamed it would be. Look at all of the lush the lush bananas, the fruit that's here in the foreground, and all of the wonderful colors that you see sprinkled back through here in the palm trees. He also does pictures, a lot of pictures of women, very few or really practically none, just none worth mentioning, of men. He does a lot of the women, and he really is able to capture their features in a lot of their daily activities. Now I want you to notice something that's different between these two and this one. She's wearing a dress. Where'd that come from? This is Tahiti. This is supposed to be kind of a unpopulated, primitive island. How does she get a dress? Missionaries, folks. The missionaries have come and they are trying to settle the island. They are trying to get the people to stop worshiping these gods that they have by the truckload, and the Madonna, like he showed before with his painting of the Madonna with the Christ child on his shoulder. There's something else about this woman that you need to notice or to know about. Here she is. She's the one of the piece of pottery I showed you earlier. This pottery is interesting because it's not solid. In the back, if you look in the back, there's a concave area, and there's a figure of Eve in the Garden of Eden on the back of this. Okay, who is this woman? Her name is Tahara. This is a nickname, Tahamana. And at this point, she's about 13 years old. And he ran into her on the other side of the island one day, and they were walking along, and she was talking to him about the island and being there. And the family saw him, and he looked like a European, which he was. And they thought, this is perfect. We'll have her marry him. So the day he met her is the day that he married her. It wasn't necessarily a marriage made out of love, but it certainly did help him a little, because this particular time in history, Tahiti didn't have shops. There wasn't a place to buy food. You had to know where to go to get it. And then you had to sometimes have somebody get it for you if it was high up in a tree. The men would go up in the trees in the area where he was, up in the mountains in the area where he was, about once a week, and climb up into the trees and bring back the fruit that they could drop from there. And the women would go down to the sea, and they would bring back the fish that the fishermen had brought in from the boats. So she becomes the gatherer of their food. They will spend the first 2 years that he is there, which is as long as he is that first time. They will spend their time together as quote-unquote husband and wife. When he left to go back to Paris, he said he remembered her sitting on the dock, and she was crying and paddling her feet in the water. She just felt very bad that he was leaving her. When he returned, in a not too distant future, she had already married somebody else. She had married somebody else who was her age. This man, at this time when she's 13, Gauguin's in his 40s. So she had married somebody closer to his age, and that marriage really did stick. They had 2 children, and if she hadn't gotten the Spanish flu in 1918, it's hard to tell how much longer she would have lived. But the second marriage was definitely a much more solid marriage than the first one had been. Some people say that this name, Tahamana, which means has many parents, is because she is a composite of other women that will also help to care for him during his time on the islands. He will go back about 4 other times, and each time he will connect with some woman who will help to take care of him. Never wrote much about any of them. It just wasn't something that he really thought was all that important. Certainly did not seem to be more important to him than his painting and his life on the island. But we think that perhaps she is a composite. But look, she's wearing a dress. She's seen the missionaries. She has 2 dresses on in these pictures. They wore the flowers in their hair because, again, it could be hot and sticky there, and the skin can sweat and perspire and not smell good, and they felt that the flowers helped to give them a nice added fragrance. And this is her name because I had just underlined it over here. He will often write the names of the people who he has done the painting of on the actual canvas. This is called the spirit of the dead watching. And one of the things that Gauguin said, when you paint, be mysterious. Put things in that will cause people to stop and wonder what it's all about. Now, some people say, and I can't agree because, and I can't disagree, that this is the most important work that came out of his first trip. Now, this is Tahara, and these are the time frame that he was there in Tahiti. He'd already been to Martinique. He's now in Tahiti, and he has done this figure, and there is a close-up of her. He said that he was painting, and she came back from wherever she had been. Sometimes she told him where she was going, and sometimes she didn't, but she came in and flopped down on the bed, and he thought that was a really good painting to do, and so he does it. She is 14. It's the second year of their time together. And I have an arrow back here to something white that unless I point these out, you might miss them. Those are the spirits that are watching over all of this. And here is death, right here. Fascinating work. Just fascinating what he comes up with. He did 10 woodcuts. He and a man in Paris had decided that they would write a book. Gauguin would write the book, and he would do 10 woodcuts to illustrate it. And then he would give it to the man, and the word noa noa means very fragrant. He would give it to the man, and the man would edit it and publish it. Well, it never got to press. But here are a couple examples of the work that he did. His woodcuts are fascinating, and I include his hand-colored images with these because sometimes the colored image doesn't show you as clearly what's going on in the painting as the black and white, because there's an animal here and over here. And something else that's interesting, when you do a woodcut, you're doing everything in reverse. So in reverse, he carved the word Tahiti, and he carved the word noa noa, and that was all done in reverse so that when it printed, it would be readable. Gauguin spent a lot of time down by the shore. He loved that. And he also had loved the work that Degas had done of horses. I want you to notice a couple of things about these pieces. These are Gauguin's work, and this is the one I've chosen for you to look at done by Gauguin. Notice how the vantage points are the same. You're down on the ground, and you're looking ahead at what you see. In this case, it's the woods along the coast of Brittany. Over here, it's Tahiti, and it's the sand and it's the waves. And his waves, I marvel at his waves. His waves are beautifully done. And his use of color is just incredible. He really appreciated Degas' fun with the colored silks and hats that the writers wore. At one of his early exhibits, Degas came up to him. They introduced each other to each other, and he said to Gauguin, "You have your foot in the stirrup." That meant a great deal to Gauguin. That meant that he was going to be able to ride this out, that he was going to become what he had hoped he would be. And that was a great artist. And he lived every day believing that it would happen that day or the next day. And it happened the year after he dies. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But to finish this, let me say this about Degas. As rough or gruff or inconsiderate or arrogant as he could be, he was actually the man who was the longest, strongest supporter of Gauguin. He never gave up on him. He really believed in him. And remember how Degas would tell Mary Cassatt to paint the same thing over and over because you'll get better every time you do it? I want you to notice something about this painting. These two paintings that Gauguin did. Notice these two horses. They're the same. He's reversed the order. It's the same horse. That's not the only place he does that. Look at this horse. You've got a male riding this horse. You have a female on this horse, but it's the same horse. So he learned some interesting things from Degas, as well as being happy to have the appreciation of somebody who was of such note as Degas was. This will end up being his largest painting. And this painting is called Where Did We Come From? Why Are We Here? And Where Are We Going? How many of us have not asked that question? And then Gauguin, in order to interpret that, has divided the painting into old age, youth and adulthood, and over here, this would be where there is the childhood, or the birth of the child. This is Gauguin's largest painting. The critical thing about this is that there's so much of what he learned about being on the island in this piece. The way the people dress, the image of their god, Hina, that is there, the women moving around through it, all animals that are in it. Look at the cat down here. There are bird, dove over here, waiting to take away the soul of the dead. In 1897, he was again back on the islands for a third time, and he decided he couldn't take it anymore. He was going to have to commit suicide. He had no money. He had no resources at all. He would go down to the docks with his paintings when he knew a ship was coming in, and he would market his paintings to the sailors or the ship's captain and hope that somebody would buy something so he would have a little bit of money that he could then exchange for some food that was available for him to buy. He had debts. He had to have a place to stay. He didn't have money. He really was at the end of the rope. And so he decides he'll commit suicide. And how does he do it? He got a hold of some arsenic. And he took as much arsenic as he had, and then he went up into the mountains. And he found a nice peaceful place, and he laid down and he waited to die. Well, the problem with arsenic, and I have no personal experience with this, the problem with arsenic is if you don't take enough, you get violently ill, but it won't kill you. He got violently ill, and he lived to tell the story. So that was his last attempt at suicide. Does a lot to show us what native life was like. I want to go back to that again because I want to point something out here. Do you see the block lines that are in here? He had done this sketch of this woman. You can tell it's the same woman. Look at the pattern on the clothing. And then he moved that idea over to here and was able to block it out in proportion because of the sketch that he had done. I'll be talking a minute or so from now about this, when will you marry painting. This is quite an important one. But in the meantime, here's native life. This is called Day of the Gods. There's the god again. Their god's name is Hina, and there is Hina. They're bringing Hina food. They are playing instruments to Hina. She has brought her child to be blessed by Hina. People in the background on horses and boats. Again, it's a Degas painting, and it's just full of interesting things. What's going on in the foreground? Well, take a look. It portrays birth, life, and death, just as the other one did, but in a different kind of statement. Birth has its toe in the water. Life has both legs in the water. And death has turned its back on life and the world. Imagine with him how much fun it might have been to have painted all of these different colors to suggest the water. And here's some of the cloisonné work that he sometimes included when it suited him. This painting is the fourth most expensive painting in the world. The two most expensive was a card player's painting by Cezanne, which I've shown you when I spoke of him in the past, and then this one. They were both upstaged recently by a painting by Willem de Kooning. And then there was another one, I forget the name of that artist at this time, let me think. Da Vinci. Da Vinci they did Solomundo. Those two paintings sold for more, but this painting sold for $210 million in 1914. His paintings don't come up for sale very frequently, but some people are still finding them. Here are some of his self-portraits. You saw this one as an entrance into this talk today. It's a beautiful soft piece. You saw this one when I was discussing his family and the life and the halo and him holding on to the snake and the apples in the background. And I think this is a very sensitive piece of him that he has done. And as I mentioned, he did a lot of writing. I went through his journal and I picked out only a few examples, but I wanted to share this one with you. I shut my eyes in order to see. Is that not your imagination? Is that not what you see when you close your eyes? I think it's just very obvious, but very, very, very true statement. And he said one time, life being what it is, one dreams of revenge. He wanted so hard to be successful, kept writing to Maddie and saying, I'm coming back, I'm bringing more paintings. And when he came back, he did ship paintings or met her in Paris and gave her a lot of his paintings, which she will then use after his death as a way to support herself and as part of a major exhibit that is shown of his work. Unfortunately, it will be the year after he dies. But he will have left her much better off than she was while he was alive because his work becomes so popular. This quote is really important to me. I just find it so fascinating. Life is hardly more than a fraction of a second. Such a little time to prepare oneself for eternity. I'm not sure, but I think that it's a good thing to remember My mother used to put important things that she had read on little pieces of paper and tape them to the space at the sink so that when she was washing dishes, she could reflect on them. And this would be one that I think could go above my sink. Life is hardly more than a fraction of a second. Such a little time to prepare oneself for eternity. It's all so very true. And it all came from the mind of Paul Gauguin. He had 3 specific areas that were important to him. His Peruvian ancestry, you see the sculpture back here, very significant to him. His role as an artist, and then his memory of living on the islands. And as I said, 4 different trips there, and he will be there when he dies. This photograph was taken of him with 2 of the island women and this man. This man will end up befriending Gauguin on the last trip to the islands. And Gauguin, by that time, has spent time in Paris and then also in Brittany, taken his work back and was selling what he could. But when he was in Brittany, for some reason or other, his arrogance took over and he got himself into a street fight with somebody who was much stronger than he. And Gauguin's ankle was shattered. And he didn't have time to have it properly repaired before he got on the boat. So as he's sailing across, he is in a great deal of pain. And this man has access to a lot of morphine, and he will give Gauguin morphine. And the morphine will end up contributing strongly to the death of this man. As I mentioned here, and I said it before, at auction today, his paintings and sculptures are going for great sums of money. Remember, When Will You Marry is the one that has sold for the most, but they are not pocket change. This is one of his last paintings. I consider this to be probably his last self-portrait. In this painting, you see his interpretation of Christ in the garden and the soldiers coming towards him. This painting was done 1 month before he died, and he didn't kill himself this time. But he said, it will be said in one of the last letters he wrote back to France, it will be said that in all my life I have been condemned to fall, to pick myself up and to fall again. Day by day, my energy fades away. By the time he got off of the ship for the last time, he was in a great deal of pain from his ankle. He had contacted the Frenchman disease, syphilis, and so he had sores from that were exacerbated by the pain in his ankle and the fact that his body couldn't figure out how to heal that shattered mess. And so here's what happens at the end. He dies with no money. He has syphilis. He has sores on his legs, and that poorly healed broken ankle. Obviously, he's very anxious. He's depressed. He has become an alcoholic over a period of time, and he now overdoses on morphine, and that is what will take his life at the end. And he is buried there on the islands today. He gifted the world with great works. He sought dreams all of his life. He found very few. But as people study his work, they learn more and more about the sensitive nature and the value to the world of art that Paul Gauguin has bequeathed to all of us. If you have any questions, you can certainly contact Willow Valley, or you can contact me directly. I want to make a special note to you that next week's lecture will not be on Monday. It's going to be, or not going to be on Tuesday, it's going to be on Monday at 10:30. And who are we going, you and I, going to take a look at? The next American artist that I want to introduce you to is Edward Hopper. Brilliant man, solitary talent who brought stillness and peace to the world through his paintings. I thought this would be a great way to intersect him into this series, even though we've been doing a lot with the French and the Impressionists. This man also sought peace and stillness, as did Gauguin, and his work is so uncluttered and so beautifully done that to look at it gives you a big drink of peace and quiet anytime you see anything he has done. So next week, I'll be here on Monday at 10:30. I hope you will be too. And then we will take a look, you and I, at the work of a very, very outstanding American artist named Edward Hopper. Are there any questions? Okay, no questions? Then it's time for me to say, see you next week. And in the meantime, God bless America. Let's have a good weekend. Thank you.